Welcome everybody to our special webinar Zoom put on by the Church Health and Growth Working Group of the Presbytery of San Jose. You are all here as invited guests and valued members of our Presbytery. So I know some of you are here as pastors, some as elders, some as members of churches, some who heard about this while trolling the dark web. I'm glad that you made your way in today. We're gonna have a great time. It's 10 o'clock and we're here just for a couple hours together with our special guest, Todd Bolsinger, who I will introduce in a moment. But first, just look around the room if you want. You can scroll through. We've all been on Zoom. See who's here. See who you know. Maybe there's a face or a name you don't know. That's okay. We're going to operate today as a community of learning, where we're going to have a chance to hear from Todd, kind of our invited expert, our guide, who's going to bring some real important content for us. It's going to engage and interact with our own lives and experiences. Whether that's in our churches or in our business settings or in whatever area you're leading in these days. So it's really going to be great. I want to say a couple things. One is that there's going to be a chance for you to ask questions and interact with Todd. So if you, as he's talking here in the beginning, if you have a question for him or something you want to find out about, direct it to me on a private chat. You see the chat function at the bottom. Go on there. I'm David Watermulder. You can just direct it to me and I'll read it for you. That way we can get to Todd, and he's going to lead us through the whole part. But that's for questions as we go. Private chat is enabled. Good. Let me pray for us and then we'll continue on. Okay, let's pray together today. Gracious, loving God, we give you thanks for the gift of life, for our life together and our life in you. I pray today that this would be a day that brings more life for us, that you would bring the light and life of your son, Jesus, to our eyes, that we would see and hear and learn and grow in what it means to be alive in you. God, we pray for our churches and for our communities, for everyone who's on this call coming to hear a word. May it be a word from you, a word for our lives. I pray today for Todd as he shares, that you would just anoint him with your spirit, guide him in his words, help him to help us, that we would all glorify you together. We pray it in your son, Jesus' name today. Amen. Amen. So welcome everybody again. Thanks for being on mute and good Zoom protocol. Todd Bolsinger is here with us. Some of you know Todd. He is a Presbyterian minister. He is a seminary professor at Fuller Seminary. He is an author, and he's written one book that I have on my bookshelf, which is called Canoeing the Mountains. And he has a second book coming out, and he'll talk about these, which is called Tempered Resilience, which I have ordered from Amazon. So I commend those two books to you. Some of you already know that material. He'll share about it. So he's a pastor, he's a professor, he's an author. He's also a husband and a dad. He's a friend to some of us in this room. Some of you know him in other ways, and he's a friend of our Presbytery. So I'm really glad to introduce Todd. And Todd, I'm going to be quiet so we can all hear from you. And would you take it away from here?
Indeed. Thanks, Dave. It's nice to be with all of you. I put you all on the Brady Bunch view for me so I could see it for just a few minutes as we got started, to see all your faces and to recognize it is really a gift for you to spend part of the Saturday with me. I have been going around the country for the better part of the last 10 years talking about leading change. That's really what I do. I started doing that when I was at San Clemente Presbyterian, helping lead our congregation through some change. I was part of a change team that Steve Yamaguchi, my executive presbyter at the time, helped enlisted me for at the Los Ranchos Presbytery. I was on a big project for the Mid-Council Commission back in the day when there was such a thing called a Mid-Council Commission. And then I have went to Fuller 6.5 years ago to work on a change project in theological education. And what it means is that my whole life is about adjusting to and helping other people navigate change wisely and well. And so as we begin today, I wanted to tell you a story about the way in which this current season that we're in has really tested all of us as leaders and absolutely creamed me as a change leader. On the Tuesday, there was a Tuesday, we were having a senior administration meeting at Fuller in March. Small group of people came in to make a presentation on this thing called the coronavirus, and how they believed that the coronavirus was going to become so important really quickly that we needed to think about taking all of our classes online for the spring quarter, about making all of our staff work remotely, and that even more so, we would ground all of our staff so that there would be no travel. So again, I'm the guy who leads change. And in that meeting, I was the most resistant person to change. I can remember saying, in a way that my colleagues will never let me forget, I was the one who said, do you think we're overreacting to this just a bit? And what I realized at that moment is that change hits people at different levels. And the way people experience change is very personally. So if you told me, hey, all we were going to do is teach online, I would have said, great. I already teach online most of the time. I've learned how to teach online. I've gone from being a guy who is a talking head preaching in rooms to a guy who understands the pedagogy of online education. I'm fine. And if you said, hey, all we're going to do is teach online and we're going to make everybody work from home, I would have said, great. I like working from home. That's not a problem. About a third of my 60 employees all work from home already. So that's not a big deal. I think all of us will be okay with that. It was when they said we would not travel that I began to find myself resistant to change, because for the better part of the last 5 years, I've traveled about 100,000 miles a year. Part of my call at Fuller was to help Fuller serve churches more directly, to try to make a shift in theological education where it was not just about the way in which we invite people to come onto our campus, get our degrees, get some initials after their name, take on a bunch of debt, and then go out and serve people, but that we actually wanted to find ways to be a resource center for the church directly in real time, serving people we called learners, even if they weren't students. In order to do that, I was on a plane a lot, and most of my staff was on a plane a lot. And so I couldn't imagine how we could possibly fulfill our charge or how we could continue to have any relevance if we weren't allowed to travel. And so I became resistant to change. By the following Friday, my entire mind had changed. By the following Friday, this is Tuesday, by Friday, I was sitting in a lift coming back from LAX after having traveled that week to Nashville and Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and everything changed for me. And it changed for me because when I went through the Denver airport, the United Airlines handed me a Clorox wipe and told me to wipe down my own seat because they weren't sure they could keep the plane at that time clean enough for all of us to be healthy because of this thing called the coronavirus. By the time I was in my lift, which was the last time I've been in a lift since then, my phone lit up with the news that we were indeed going online, we were indeed going to work at home, and we were indeed not going to travel. And I was the one 100% in favor of all of it. Change hits people at different ways and at different times. And the challenge of a leader is to navigate through that change, especially as it disrupts you yourself. And so what I want to talk about today is a kind of leadership that is needed, particularly in these moments, that is actually rooted in the best leadership theory. It also is demonstrated throughout the experience of the scriptures and throughout church history, and is actually a way that we as Christians can live out our values in very consistent ways in all the places of life where we're called to be leaders in ways that are really different. And in the middle of that challenge, we'll be able to take that on. I don't minimize the challenge that we're in today. It's really disruptive. I mean, somebody said we are in 1918, 1929, and 1968 all at the same time. We are in the middle of a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a crisis of social justice that needs to be is long overdue in being addressed all at the same time. Our churches are stressed, our leaders are exhausted, most of us feel overwhelmed, and we are still called to this moment to figure out how to lead wisely and well. So I just love the opportunity that I have to spend some time with you and to be able to talk these things through with you. And I'm going to take you through some of the concepts that have been kind of shaping my own life and my leadership and the work that I now get to do with people literally all over the world. So thanks for spending time. I'm going to share my screen. But first I want to do something. I want to ask you to chat in something. I want you to go to your computer and begin to use the chat to everyone. And I know you're all from San Jose Presbytery, but here's what I really want to know. Where are y'all from? Where is home from for you? One of the best parts about being from California is that very few of us are from the place we're in. It always feels like God brought us to this place. And sometimes it's just a few miles, like Joey coming from San Francisco. For me, I was born in Arcata, California. You know where that is? Way up north in the Redwoods, 6 miles above. You go to Eureka and you still got to go 6 more miles. to find the place where my grandparents had an Italian restaurant, and I was born when my parents were graduate students at Humboldt State University. Lauren, so as we look at the different places that we're from, what we start realizing is look at the diversity. Houston, Texas, born in San Diego, Omaha, Nebraska, San Antonio, Lawrence, South Carolina, Freeport, Texas, the Philippines, Atlanta, Finger Lakes, New York, right? Phoenix, Arizona, Monterey, Seoul, Korea, Atlanta, Georgia, Pittsburgh, Pasadena, way to go, Bruce. That's where I am now. San Jose. One of the reasons why I love to point this out is that I actually do believe there is something about being with a group of people who you believe that God has called together to take on a challenge. I really want you to have a sense that even though we are separated by Zoom, and yes, you guys serve in a very diverse presbytery. I spend a lot of my time in the San Jose area and the Bay Area for Fuller, and I have for years. It's a very diverse place, not unlike where I live in Southern California. There is a sense at times when I look around and think, God brought these people to this moment to be part of this challenge together. And so, even as you think about that, I want you to be mindful of it. Let me ask you one more thing to chat in as we begin this morning. I told you for me that I became aware that the world was in a radical time of change because of this pandemic, because United Airlines handed me a Clorox wipe. What was the moment for you? When did you know that the world had just changed in a way that you had never seen before, that you were that either because of this pandemic or wherever you were in, that you realized you are not in the same, we are not in Kansas anymore, Toto. We're in a whole different world. What was the moment for you? For me, it was the Clorox wipe from United Airlines. That was the thing that began. Just chat in again. So Stanford Library is closed. Somebody said, yeah, can you imagine? The libraries, a church member said his employer, NASA, was preparing people to work at home. If NASA wants you to work at home, they don't want, right? Remote worship with Dave Watermulder, my wife hoarding all the TV she could find, a virus found in the San Jose airport, right? Grade school, e-learning with children, teaching my kinder's parents were sharing their concerns, our health education classes online at Kaiser, the wave of deaths in New York City. Yeah, Joey, that was actually for me a significant thing. Friends of mine pastoring in New York City who were saying to me, no, we're already pastoring people with COVID, right? There's these very particular moments. Very often when I ask this, somebody will say, it was the NBA. It was the NBA shutting down. I thought the whole thing was a sham. But when the NBA shut down, or when March Madness shut down, oh my gosh, we knew that was serious, right? I was very aware that when I was getting that Clorox wipe, it was March 13. On March 15, that Sunday, that was Friday the 13th, on that Sunday, every one of my students, every one of my coaching clients, my consulting clients, everyone contacted me over the weekend. It was just amazing. And they said, we're all going online. We're trying to figure out Facebook Live. We're trying to figure out this thing called Zoom. I remember getting a call from my mother saying that my niece had helped her. My mother has never had an iPhone. She's never been on Facebook. She likes her flip phone and she thinks a fax machine is fine. And all of a sudden she was told, Amanda came and helped us, and now I'm a Zoomer, and I'm helping all my PEO ladies get on Zoom, Todd, my 78-year-old mother. When my mother became a Zoomer, I knew we were in for the long haul. Because again, the experiences, we've come from different places, we've had different experiences, but the common experience is one of navigating rapid change. One last piece about this, just as we begin. In the last 5 years, I have been asked to speak across the church. As diverse as it comes. Every stripe of our cousins in the Presbyterian churches, some of our wayward brothers and sisters who left us. Yep, I get to speak to them. I spoke to a group of UCC pastors and a Knights at Columbus Hall in St. Louis, Missouri. I have spoken to Lutheran Church Missouri Synod pastors who asked me not to talk about the fact that my daughter is on staff at a Presbyterian church and is called to be a pastor. I have spoken to people who do not speak to each other, because the common experience we're all having in leadership is the world is changing rapidly, and we need to figure out how to navigate and lead wisely and well through it. So in the rest of our time together, what we'll do is we'll set up the context, and the context that calls us to learn leadership in a different way. We'll do some conversation about that, and then we'll take it even further into a few concepts that you can then take into your context to be able to lead wisely and well. So let me take you through some material even now as we begin. I call this leading in uncharted territory, and it really for me begins with a quote from a guy named Ronald Heifetz at Harvard University, who says that leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. And what Heifetz is pointing here is that the challenge of leadership is not always the challenges externally. That the hardest part of leadership is not that the world is changing, that we have to have Zoom classrooms, or that we have to shut down our worship services. The hardest part of leadership is when we have to disappoint people in order to fulfill our mission. And the key phrase in this that makes almost every leader I know get a lump in their throat is the phrase, your own people. Leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. Leadership is ultimately about disappointing people in such a way that they continue to fulfill the mission. So for me, leadership is about transformation. Management or stewardship is about taking care of the things entrusted to our care and handing them over. So whether we're handed a church community or a building or a budget or a set of theological convictions, to be good and faithful stewards means we take care of those things and hand them over to the next generation. Leadership means that we take care of those exact same things, and in order to accomplish their mission, they have to go through a transformation. They've got to become different. Stewardship would say that when Moses took them into the wilderness, he just needed to make sure that he counted noses, and if 600,000 went in, 600,000 would go out. When I was a senior pastor in San Clemente, I used to always talk about the fact that I wanted the best youth leaders we could find. And I realized that unconsciously what I really wanted was a youth manager. If you take 10 kids to camp, you got to bring 10 kids home. 90% is not an A. It's not a good day for me as the senior pastor, and it'll be a worse day for you as a youth leader if we got to call a parent and say, we lost your son at camp. But what you really have is Moses taking a group of people into the wilderness and leading them through their own resistance to the place where that community of people can be prepared for the challenge that God has given them to fill the land and to become the people of God for the world. And it's that transformation that is what we're talking about. Leadership is energizing a community of people toward their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world. So let me tell you where this hit me. Some years ago, when I finished at Fuller, I wrote a dissertation in my PhD that became the book "It Takes a Church to Raise a Christian." It's my first book. It still sells about 10 or 12 copies a year. I think there's a group of people somewhere in the world who use it as a textbook, and so it's still out there. But when I was asked to spend some time with a group of Methodists in Portland, Maine, they asked me to come and speak, and what I spoke on was the way in which the communal practices of spiritual formation, the way we are transformed by a Christian community if we have shared practices. At the end of the day, they asked me to do a question answer time because back then we didn't have Zoom and it was hard to get good Q&A in a room of 200 people. So they had a special setting just for Q&A. 60 people came to the Q&A. When they turned in their questions, 59 of them all had the same question. How do we keep our church from dying? I didn't come to talk about churches dying. I came to talk about churches growing deeper. And what it hit me was that in moments of stress, no matter what we want to talk about, there is an underlying deeper question that we are facing all the time. So that put me on a journey of thinking about the differences of what we often say we're doing and what we're really doing. One of my friends once put it to me this way. He said, we live in a world that is changing dramatically, Todd. And because the world is changing so dramatically, we find ourselves, even in places where we don't think, needing to rethink what it means to be the church. He looked at me and said, when I started my ministry 40 years ago in Alabama, we didn't even keep track of church membership or church attendance. Oh, we turned in numbers to the Presbytery, but nobody worried about them. because every church was growing, because every church was fine, and every church was fine because in every community, you basically knew this: if a man skipped church on Sunday, his boss asked him about it on Monday. Everybody belonged to some church. The only question is whether we were doing as well as the Baptists or the Methodists. And that has changed dramatically. Even before COVID, we found ourselves having our churches changing dramatically. Daryl Guter, our old friend from Princeton Seminary, used to put it this way: if Western societies have become post-Christian mission fields, how can traditional churches become then missionary churches? Even before COVID, we were asking ourselves some deeper questions about the relevance of the church. And now it is accelerated in this time where we find ourselves asking ourselves larger questions about, can our churches actually not only survive, but thrive? Can they make an impact or a difference in the world around us that will be able to be seen and felt by our neighbors? So one of the ways that I want you to think about this is from the metaphor of Lewis and Clark. Let me say something right up front about this metaphor. Lewis and Clark is a story that is fraught. It is like the biblical stories to me. When I see the stories in the scriptures, I think about an Old Testament professor who once said, the Bible doesn't give us models to emulate. The Bibles give us mirrors we identify with. When we think about our biblical characters who are in the divinely inspired scriptures, we are given brutally honest pictures of incredibly frail people who in their moment, some of their best moments, give us a glimpse of what we could be by the power of the Spirit. So when I talk about Lewis and Clark, I know that I'm talking about a part of our history of American history that is very similar, because in many ways, these very flawed people who were men of their era, who reflected the biases and the prejudices of their era, who even participated in projects that we could feel ambivalent about today, some of which we have benefited from, some of us we have experienced the pain of, find ourselves recognizing that in their story, there is something in that our story we can understand and find hope and direction. So let me take you to August 12th, 1805. On August 12th, 1805, Meriwether Lewis took a drink out of a small stream on the side of the Montana side of the Idaho and Montana border. That small stream was actually a spring where the water from Montana ran all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. That spring on the border of Montana and Idaho is part of the Missouri River that ran across the northern part of the continent over to the Mississippi River, where it joined it in St. Charles, Missouri, to where it would run down to the Gulf of Mexico and then out to the Atlantic Ocean. That spring is what they had been looking for. And what they believed at that moment is that they would take a drink out of that spring, walk up the side of the Lemhi Pass. They would find a spring on the other side that would become a river that would connect all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And if they could make that connection between the Missouri River on one side and what we now know is the Columbia River on the other side, the United States of America would have a water route that would cut across the continent. The water route was critical because for over 300 years, the single form of economic business strategy for every nation in Europe was to claim the water route that would connect Asia to Europe. And if you had the water route, then that meant that you had the trade route, and the trade route was over water because it's easier to take raw material over water than over land. And so for 300 years, ever since Europeans had stumbled upon this land mass that we call North America, they've been just looking for how to get through the darn thing and how to have a water route that would get through, and whoever claimed it would become the wealthiest nation. And Thomas Jefferson wanted this fledgling nation that was only a few decades old to claim that water route. They believed, along with everyone else, that those two rivers would connect and that would be the water route. So when Meriwether Lewis walked up the side of the Lemhi Pass and looked over, expecting to find a river on the other side, expecting that after 18 months of traveling upstream, they would now get to go downstream. And after going downstream, they would float all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They would be known as the explorers who discovered the Northwest Passage. They would take a selfie and send it back to Thomas Jefferson, and then they would turn around and head home, and they would be welcomed as the greatest explorers in history because they would be the founders of the Northwest Passage. And as you know from your 11th grade history class, they found the Rocky Mountains. Now, two things I want you to think about at this moment. One is this: they spent the winter with the Mandan tribe. Matter of fact, they were treated beautifully by the Native American tribes all the way through. They had a remarkable experiences with all but one group at one time. And when the Mandan welcomed them for the entire winter, they asked them, we've heard there's a river on the other side and we're going to find it. And they said, there is a river on the other side. You just have to cross over mountains. And they said, mountains, we're from Virginia. We're really good at mountains. We understand mountains. We have the Shenandoah Mountains. Now, if any of you have been to Shenandoah National Park, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. But the Shenandoah Mountains are lower in elevation than the St. Gabriel's that are right outside my door. The Shenandoah Mountains are rounded peaks. You can imagine dragging a canoe over them, and you absolutely would understand how a river would run through them. They had no mental model of mountains that would jut up to 14,000 feet, that would be 300 miles long, that would have 60 miles of hip-deep snow, that a river could not be navigated through it. They didn't have a model of the way the world was organized because of the way they had come from before. Their mental model of the past, the geography they knew, shaped the way they thought about the future, the geography in front of them. The second thing that I like to point out is that they'd seen the Rocky Mountains in front of them for 3 months. I mean, you can't really hide them. If you've ever been to Kansas or to eastern Colorado on a clear day, they're out there. You just see them. And for 3 months, they had been staring at those peaks. But Meriwether Lewis wrote in his journal, I refuse to believe this will be anything but a safe and comfortable path. So not only are we shaped by our past experiences, we're shaped by our denial and our hope that it's going to be good for us and easy for us, and it's going to get better for us, which is why when we hit these moments of deep disruption, it becomes so disappointing to our people. I remember the week after March 15, I had a number of pastors who I spoke to and asked them how that I coach with and I work with. I said, how'd it go this week? And they said, well, we got through the whole Facebook Live thing and we did the whole Zoom thing and it went okay. And people were patient and we're figuring out the technology and it's okay. I just hope we don't have to cancel Easter. I love that phrase, cancel Easter, as if somehow the way on which we worship will determine whether or not there was a resurrection or not, right? But that's the way it feels to most pastors. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine we wouldn't have Easter services. We've already got the lilies ordered. We've already got the orchestra planned. We've got people, we got a children's choir. It's already rehearsing. I would hate to have to cancel Easter. Now today, 7 months later, we all look back at that and go, that was quaint, wasn't that? like really, we all got through that. What's really hard isn't figuring out if we canceled Easter. What's really hard is figuring out how do you get everybody to agree on when we gather again together. I mean, so you start realizing that we live looking at the future with our expectations of the past. And that one of the critical moments in times like this in leadership is to actually believe that the world in front of you is nothing like the world behind you. And that's one of the big disruptions of leadership. How do you canoe over mountains? If your whole life has been a water person, if you were brought on the trip because you can build your own canoes, you're a good whitewater navigator. If you're the whole reason you came is because you wanted to do a canoe trip, and all of a sudden you found yourself in a moment when you're staring at those mountains, what do you do? Meriwether Lewis said, he just wrote in his journal, we proceeded on. One of the men wrote, those were the most terrible mountains we ever beheld. I think he thought his job was to carry the canoes over them. What most of the people had to grapple with at that moment is that our understanding of our trip and our journey is radically different than it was before. You can't canoe over mountains. We were trained for a different context. This is where we are in the church today. We were trained for rivers, not mountains. We were trained for a world where we had a home court advantage because of culture, where people expected to go to church, where the whole point was whenever people show up, you preach to them. When they get in trouble, you care for them. If there's needs, you create programs for them. And if you do it wisely and well, you'll be fine and you'll be relevant. Now we live in a world where literally with a click of the button, people can leave. With deep discouragement, we find that how disconnected, and we find that people are aligned in ways that are more about sometimes their demographics or their social connections or their political parties than they are to our communities of faith. And we're in a totally different way, in a totally different territory. What this calls for is a different kind of leadership, a different moment that we find ourselves in. And this is the moment when we step over the Lemhi Pass, when we find ourselves in uncharted territory, when we find ourselves in a place that is unprecedented in our experience, what we recognize is the way we were taught to lead was built on a set of assumptions that are now profoundly different. We were taught that leaders are experts. Just think of that for a second. Everybody who comes to a seminary, I say, somebody said to them, "You're the best Christian I know. You should go pro. You should go off to professional Christian school. They should train you some stuff, and then you could come back here and help us. And when you graduate from seminary, you have a Master of Divinity." Sounds like a superhero, right? And your job is to be the expert Bible teacher, the expert at church history, the expert at pastoral counseling, the expert at bedside care, the expert when people go through death or people go through divorce or they go through crisis. You're the expert. You're the one that they call. And the whole point is that you should be the people that when people are in doubt or despair or depression or discouragement, you are to give them the perfect word that encourages them and brings them forward. So what happens when you find yourself as a church stepping over the Lemhi Pass and really realizing that the terrain is totally different than you expected? And people look at you and say, "What do we do? What do we do, Pastor? What do we do, elders? What do we do, session members? Session, what are we doing? What do we do, Mom? What do we do, Dad? What do we do?" When you find yourself at that moment, when the honest answer is, "I don't know," then you are now in an adaptive challenge. Let's be clear that you understand the difference. It's really helpful when you start thinking about the kinds of problems we're facing. Technical problems are problems experts can solve. They're the application of current knowledge, skills, and tools to resolve a situation. They're not trivial. They can be complicated. A heart bypass is a technical problem. You don't want someone doing that who's not an expert. Flying an airplane, technical problem. I would say preaching on the Trinity, technical problem. An expert should solve it. Walking with people through the death of a child, you want a well-trained, empathic, skilled practitioner to walk with people through the hardest thing possible. This is the application of current knowledge, skills, and tools. And it's the reason why we train and we keep growing and we go through stuff like master's programs and doctor of ministry programs. They're important. An adaptive challenge is a challenge that when you face it, it can't be solved with one's existing knowledge, skills, and tools. And it requires people to make a shift. Look at the list in values, expectations, attitudes, or habits of behavior. If you're at all like me, you see that phrase and internally everything within you starts getting anxious. A shift in values, expectations, attitudes, habits of behavior. How easily does anybody shift these things? And that's the point. These are systemic problems with no clear answers. So again, let's be really, really clear. If you have a technical challenge, you want a technical solution. The next time I get on a plane, I don't want an adaptive pilot. I don't need there to be any shift of values, expectations, or attitudes. I don't need the person to be learning as they go. I don't want to ask the pilot, "What are we going to do?" and have them say, "I don't know. I've never had to land in this before," right? You don't want that. I don't want adaptive dentistry. I want there to be technical solutions to technical problems. The problem for most of us is that all of us called into leadership in the life of the church, whether we are clergy or laity, whether we are ordained pastors or elders or lay people, is that we are called in every place to go forward faithfully. And most often it's going to be an adaptive challenge that we're facing. Ed Friedman is a Jewish rabbi. His work, he passed away about 20 years ago, and his work still remains seminal in this. He was a Jewish rabbi who was a marriage and family therapist who also worked in Washington, D.C. as a consultant. So I said he knew dysfunction at every level. And one of the things that he puts is this, and look at this quote. This is like, for me, if nothing else, this quote is probably worth your 2 hours, and it's not even what I said. When any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked. So just notice that first phrase. Notice that when you are leading and I am leading, we are leading now in relationship systems. That's what makes this hard. This isn't a factory. This isn't an industry in that way. This isn't something that is producing some product that we just got to crank out. This isn't some supply chain that we've got to make sure that we get all the fat out and make it lean and get rid of all. It's a relationship system. And good leaders understand that even those businesses are relationship systems. When relationship systems like churches and families and communities and nonprofits and the best businesses, when those relationship systems are imaginatively gridlocked. So just think about that phrase for a second. When was the last time you were in a meeting where you had a sense that it was just imaginatively gridlocked? No matter how long we sat here, there was not going to be any better idea. Like we couldn't come up with a better idea. We're just stuck. If you haven't been in one, I invite you to a faculty meeting. Like we're like the most genius people in the world have a tendency to always want to go back to their expertise. And when any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked, it cannot get free simply through more thinking about the problem. Conceptually stuck systems cannot be unstuck simply by trying harder. So here's what I want to say to you, especially to those of you who just feel like you're exhausted at this moment. You've been 7 months into the pandemic. Your congregation is trying to figure out what to do with the economic system that is throwing everything off. You're trying to respond wisely and well to issues of justice. You are beginning to feel the sense that we need to be more involved prophetically, and you're not sure how to do that well or even talk about that well. You find yourself in this moment that just you wonder if we're even going to survive. Will our congregation make it? Will my family make it? Will our businesses make it? And you find yourself overwhelmed and imaginatively gridlocked. And the answer to this moment is not to paddle harder. Remember, it is a complete, utter waste of time to paddle harder when you're in a river where there isn't any water. And yet what most of us do at this moment is we just try harder the things we've always done. What Friedman says is that for a fundamental reorientation to occur, that spirit of adventure, which optimizes serendipity and which enables new perceptions beyond the control of our thinking processes, must happen first. A spirit of adventure. What did Friedman mean by a spirit of adventure? A spirit of adventure requires learning, and it results in loss. A spirit of adventure, in this case, is exactly like an adaptive challenge. It starts with, I don't know, and it results in dropping the canoes. And a spirit of adventure is when you say, whatever's around the bend, we're not sure what it is, but we're going to go explore it and we're going to learn it. And we know this is dangerous. There's no way I can let anybody be safe. One of my students who's working on this said that her whole life, she has been told that her job as a pastor was to create safe spaces, make the place safe for people. She began to listen to people like Brene Brown, and she began to think about adaptive challenges, and she began to probe deeply as a spiritual director with people. And she came up one day and said, my job isn't to make safe spaces. My job is to make brave spaces. My job is to help the church become a place and leaders become a place where they can learn, they can face their fears, and they can continue on. That's the spirit of adventure. So here's the first principle. And let's just talk about this for a moment, and then we'll pause and we'll take some questions and we'll try to make sure that we understand this whole notion. An adaptive moment is a moment that requires a spirit of adventure. When you step off the map, you step out of the river, you look across an uncharted territory into an unknown world, and you say, I don't know, but we are going to proceed on. And what you have to realize at that moment is people are going to resist you. If you came on this journey because you thought it was a canoe trip, you're going to struggle when the leader says to you, by the way, we need you to drop the canoes, even if you built them with your own hands. We might be breaking them up for firewood because we're about to go into the snow. And you're no longer the expert whitewater rafter. You're now the dude who carries stuff. And your identity is challenged. And at this moment, realize that people don't resist change, they resist loss. Now, here's what I want to say to all of us who have been in ministry for a while, whether layperson or pastor or whoever. If you've ever walked with anybody through loss, then you are perfectly equipped for this moment. If you were trained as a Stephen minister, if someone taught you or you experienced the difference of what it is to have hope, that you don't need people to give you bromides of blessings. You're not looking for people to give you cliches. There is a way to take people through loss so that they come out the other side. Our problem is that we know how to do that with individuals, and we've never learned how to do that with a community. And so the adaptive challenge of the moment is helping communities of people, churches, groups of folks committed to a mission that now is different than they expected, go through the experience of moving from their own resistance to a new day of engagement. People don't resist change, they resist loss. What this also means is that what we need for leadership in adaptive moments is not giant visions, but empathic, truthful calling out of reality. Jim Collins, who's one of the premier leadership thinkers, whose book Good to Great has been read by more people than I know, said, great leadership is not started with a huge vision. It started when a person looks at the brutal facts of a painful situation and says, we're going to work to make that better. And so if you find yourself in your community and you're saying, we need a stop sign at this corner, and I don't know why people are resisting it. We need better childcare. We need a more just housing system. We need ways for the church to care for the most vulnerable. We need a way to be able to welcome folks who don't feel welcome in someone else. And when people get resistant to the change, they're not being stubborn, they're fearful. And adaptive change starts with helping people learn to work through those fears. People don't resist change, they resist loss. Okay, I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask you to type in whatever questions you have. And here's the way I want you to think about this. I taught high school Bible for 1 year. I was a Bible teacher at a Christian high school for 1 year. And when I was that high school Bible teacher, what I really had to learn how to do was to help students read the Bible. They were helping Christians read the Bible. And when I got them to read the Bible, what I did was I asked them to make some marks in their Bibles. And I found it was really interesting. The high school students at this Christian high school, most of them hadn't ever actually read their Bible. What they had done is they'd listened to their youth pastor talk about their Bible. And so what I made them do is read the Bible. And as they came across something, I said, if you find something in the middle of this that inspires you, just put an exclamation point. What stands out positively so far? Why? What do you want to text? What do you want to underline? What do you want to type in your notes? What do you want to tweet for the world to hear? What do you want to tattoo on your body so you'll never forget it? Whatever that phrase is, whatever that thought is, what inspires you? Think about that. What you've just heard in this opening section, if anything inspires you, just think about that for a second. If it raises a question that you're not sure about, well, this is a good moment to use the questions. Just put a question mark. What questions have been raised? Maybe some of them is just making sure you get clear. Like my students are like, Todd, what's the difference between an umen and a thumen? What's the difference between a Sadducee and a Pharisee? I don't get who are all the ites, Moabites, Canaanites, Jezebites, like, right? If some of the things I've said feel confusing to you, or you want to get clarity on it, raise a question. But I also want you to pay attention to a different category, which is what has irked you? I said, this is when you're reading the Bible, read it honestly. What rubs you wrong or created dissonance with you? What is the thing that you're not sure you believe, even though you heard it? I remember my students saying, they got to kill the pets. They go into the promised land, they got to kill all the people, but they also got to kill the pets. Right? What irked you? And then I also want you to pay attention to what changes seem to be demanded of you. What's going to require of a change of you? I told my students I wanted them to put a little delta sign in their Bibles. So exclamation point, question mark, little cuss words symbol, or delta sign. My shout out to math teachers. What changes seem to be demanded of you? And even in the moments, if you want to send to Dave any one of these, especially the inquiry. And if you have any irks, send them along too. He'll protect your identity. Irks are my favorite. I tell my doctoral students, I'll give you extra credit for irks, because I think the irks are often the places where I grow and other people grow. So Dave, let's have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll take a bit of a break, and we'll come back to the category, to it some more. So go ahead. You're muted, Dave.
Thank you. Thanks, Todd. I just put in the text in the chat box, send me your questions, comments, just like Todd said, and I will read them to him, and he can respond. That's the way we want to just do it. So first one that came in. Does vision help mission get past resistance? If so, how? Does vision help mission get past resistance? How?
Yeah, so part of it, what vision does is vision inspires us to yearn for something more. Like there's the famous quote that says, if you want to build a ship, don't get somebody to gather the woods, but get them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. I'm a huge fan that casting vision makes a difference. The problem is that when most people get inspired by a vision, they are not yet ready for the hardships of the vision. So what adaptive leadership does is it takes seriously that there is an aspiration out there that really does inspire us, but that we have to start from the actual place that we start. So one of the things we'll talk about in the next hour is that adaptive change is always a healthy adaptation of your actual values, your core values. So if what you're trying to do is, if you just keep trying to inspire people, after a while, they just get cynical, right? You know this, right? Like it's the person who just keeps saying, it's going to get better. It's going to get better. There's this famous principle called the Stockdale paradox, which is built on Admiral James Stockdale, who was the longest serving POW in Vietnam. And what he said is the Stockdale paradox is this. He said, when you are going through a deeply difficult trial, you need to hold on to two things. One is you need to confront the brutal facts of the reality, and you need to maintain hope that someday this will all be worth it. That someday you'll look back at this moment and say, this is the thing I'm glad that I never missed, that I went through it. I think about this a lot. I often think, what it's going to be like for my son is a millennial. He's 28 years old. And I said, a day is going to come when your grandkids are going to interview you for school projects. They're going to go, Grandpa, what was it like to go through 9/11, 2008, and 2020? And you're going to explain, and what you're going to have a chance is to tell a story about what the world was like and what you liked in that moment. And you want to be proud of yourself in that moment. You want to be able to talk about that moment. And so vision is not just, hey, it's going to be great. Vision is like the reminder that this is bigger than us and that we want to participate in that. But it has to start with the brutal facts. What Stockdale was asked, he said, who are the people that didn't make it out of the POW camps? And his answer was the optimists. The ones who went around saying, oh, don't worry, this will be over by Christmas. And then Christmas would come and they were devastated. It's the way I experience a lot of people right now in COVID. Last spring, okay, we shut down. We thought this thing would be over by Halloween. Now you got a bunch of people going, it's not going to be over yet. And so they're just giving up. So vision is really important. It's not just vision to have a vision of the future that's inspiring. It's to have a reality, to project yourself into a reality of what you want your life to be like because of this time.
Okay, let me build on that one with another vision question, and then I'll keep going with you, Todd. One came in that said, what do you think of Bonhoeffer's statement about how he hates visionaries because they want to cast the church in their own image? That's a paraphrase.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So here's, this is really, really important. Partly think about this. So one of the parts about vision, I think, is the vision to actually see things as they are. So let me, I'll let you guys clean this up later. One of the problems that we're dealing with right now in dealing with, like, say, some of the white normativity of the church is that many of us don't have the capacity to see or hear our brothers and sisters of color who've told them about the reality that the world has been for them. So when we step in well-intended to want to make a change, we actually are like blind people trying to step in and help people cross the street. Mm-hmm. And what so many of our brothers and sisters of color have been saying to people like me, like people who, like me, who were shaped in a world that gave me advantages, is you've got to stop trying to solve things until you can see things. Mm. So part of the vision is the capacity not to try to see things in your image, but to see the reality for what it is. And that means training your eyes to see. And as a person who didn't wear glasses until I was 50, I'm still getting used to that idea.
Okay. Let me ask you, here's one that came in. It says, what does transformation look like for a congregation of seniors or elderly people? Mm-hmm. Hearing this kind of all this exciting language, and here's the reality of this congregation: seniors and elderly. What would transformation look like in that setting?
Well, one of the parts that needs to be done is this is a moment for us in the church to ask this question about, so what makes us different than every other group in the world? Mm-hmm. Is that we actually believe that every generation belongs to us. Like when Moses took the people of God through the Red Sea, they carried babies. So we Presbyterians baptize babies. Why? Because in the same way that they went through the water, we take our children through the water. And there's not a single word that says, oh, by the way, you got to be fit enough to cross into the wilderness to go. Yeah. So it gives us this moment to say what we bring differently to the table is not that we're going to be some kind of young, spry core of discovery. We are going to be the whole people of God, trusting God for our transformation as we go through this journey. Yeah. And I believe that what that particularly means for those of us, for our congregations that are older, is to ask the question, okay, so what is our part in this? Mm-hmm. What does it mean for us to be people of wisdom and generosity and legacy? What does it mean for us to be people who believe that we are to raise up the next generation, or to create spaces for people that would never have gotten in the door? What's it mean for us to begin to lay down our lives and to care for people? I'm 56 years old, and I think all the time, you know, I've got maybe 25 good years left if I can take care of my health. What do I want to do in this last 25 years that it's going to make the vision of the church the place that my children and my grandchildren and even those folks who my spiritual children and grandchildren, people who I've cared for in my congregation, and they're going to care for others who aren't going to know my name. I participate in what God wants to do in that future. So it's really important for us to give a vision that is bigger than just kind of this moment.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to keep going through these questions. So you've got a lot coming in, so I'll keep it going. Here's one. Would you share examples of churches who have used the advice in your books to transform? What did they do, and what were the results? That came in by email before the talk today, just so you know, it's more general.
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next hour, but let me just say this. The main thing they did is they began to do two things. This is two things I want you to know. They began to listen to more diverse voices. They brought more people to the table, more diversity, more younger, newer, different ethnic backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds. They began to add more voices to the table so there could be deeper learning. It's just the acknowledgement that if all you've been is a canoeer, you think everything is about paddling harder, get more voices to the table. And that's also a great opportunity to think about using the global church and others to learn from. And the second they did is they began to listen to the pain points of their community. They began to recognize the reason we exist is to love God and neighbor. Mm-hmm. And what we've often said is our job is to love God and each other. Mm-hmm. Right? We love God and neighbor. And we love our neighbor as ourselves. The assumption is that we're going to care for us. But the transformation is in the love of neighbor. And I actually, to be honest, I learned this in Silicon Valley, in your own neighborhood. I was challenged by a group of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who said, Todd, every time you talk about the things you're doing at Fuller, you talk about why this is good for Fuller. Nobody cares about Fuller. Nobody cares about your church either. What they care about is, does Fuller or does your church care about them?
Hmm.
So anything you want to do, it better be something that the world will say, these folks, they care about us.
Hmm.
So get more voices to the table, listen more to people outside the church, and then we can talk about the ways in which you do wise experiments along the way.
That's great. All right. Another one kind of sounds related to that. Good highlight on shifting to moving groups of people instead of just individuals. What do we shift in our leadership to drive change in groups? Are things really that different?
Awesome. These are great questions, by the way. Thank you for this engagement. I love this. So one of the things you have to do is you've got to start normalizing in groups.
Mhm.
And normalizing means you've got to get a group of people together, like a leadership team together. This is a place where, again, this is where we Presbyterians, this is what I say to you're my home tribe. We should be leading the church in this. This is what we believe in. The most important phrase to me in the Book of Order is together with the pastor, the session will, together with the session, it's together with. So what we should be doing at this moment is saying we will always are asking how we move forward.
Mm.
So leadership has to be consistent, it has to be clear, it has to be even clear about what it's learning. I mean, we all know what happens. We can watch what's happening in our nation right now, that what happens when people in leadership are divided, right? When you've got certain people in leadership saying one thing about the pandemic and other people saying another thing about the pandemic, what happens is everybody will do nothing,
Mm-hmm.
which means they will sit here, go back to the old way. They're going to just start going back and canoeing,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody moves forward. So you've got to continually come together, start with conviction, discern what we're doing, and bring people along together.
A related question here is on the chat. It says spirit, talking about spirit of adventure. Love that. How do you convince others that there is adventure to be found in this pandemic, especially maybe older folks like our parents? How do you invite people into that? This is from a business leader, but that's the question here.
Yeah, it's hard, right? Like it's my mother, right? I couldn't get my mother. My poor mom, she heard me talking about this. I couldn't get my mom to buy an iPhone. Mom, it's the easiest phone in the world. Like, and you can go online, you can see what your grandkids are doing. Like they put up pictures. No. But all of a sudden, the idea that she'd be locked away in her house, when there's enough urgency, when they could go, look, my niece could go, look, Grandma, I'll put you on this thing called Zoom. Just click a button. My niece sent my mom a Chromebook.
Yeah.
All she had to do was like push a button. When we tell you push a button and you can see the faces of everyone you love. And I do think there's something about saying to our older folks, yes, there's urgency. You're experiencing the pain of it already. Let me walk you through the steps, small steps, toward experiencing that there is growth to be done. And when my mother wrote me and said, my job is to get all the older PEO ladies on Zoom. I mean, my mom's 78. So she's talking about getting like the PEO ladies. My job is to do that. She was transformed in that moment because she loves her kids and her grandkids.
Yeah.
I just think there's something about that we can use.
So there's two comments that I just read out. One says, I like the quote about systemic problems with no clear answers. It seems to me that since there's no clear answers, then it opens the door to various answers, and it's time to try some new things. And then a second comment, more a comment than a question. What a great opportunity to practice and pray the serenity prayer and to live each day one day at a time. Serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah. So let me say something about the person who raised the serenity prayer. I think one of the most powerful things in my new book, Tempered Resilience, is about spiritual practices needed for leaders who are trying to lead change in the face of resistance. So by far the hardest thing. So I wrote Canoeing the Mountains because when I would go around the country working with churches, I would have pastors say, look, seminary didn't prepare me for this world I'm in. The way I learned to lead was it's technical solutions. I needed to learn this new way of leading. For the last 5 years, I've traveled around the world and I've had people say to me, but what's really hard is this resistance thing. It's way harder to deal with the resistance of your own people than it is even with the challenges outside. And what I realized is the answer to that was not technique, it was formation. So spiritual practices that continue to form us to be resilient people is what the new book is about. And what I learned was that there are sets of spiritual practices that we already do, but those spiritual practices are usually built on an older version of ourselves. So to ask, what are the practices I need to do today to be faithful for the challenge in front of me? One of them just mentioned is the serenity prayer. Another one I use a lot is the prayer of examine by Ignatius, or prayers of lament, to teach me how to deal with the brutal facts of the world and at the same time have hope. So there's practices that we talk about in the new book.
Yeah. Okay. Another one is here. How can we figure out if we are conceptually stuck or just polarized?
Good question. Well, I would say in one sense, it doesn't matter, like you are, because polarization is a kind of imaginative gridlock.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I say they are this way and I can't talk to them,
Mm-hmm.
we're stuck. I mean, I just consulted with a church where literally the session and the COM and the pastor were stuck because there was a mental model that said these people can't talk to each other. And what ended up happening is it was nothing more than it ended up being a power move. Who could get the most amount of power to try to unblock the roadblock? And what they needed people in the middle of it that could say to them, look, you are imaginatively gridlocked. The harder you work on this, you are not going to get better. What you need to do is take a deep breath and ask, what can we learn here?
Mm-hmm.
And what are we afraid of losing? And everybody had something to lose.
Yeah.
Church was afraid of losing something. The pastor was afraid of losing something. COM was afraid of losing something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you started realizing if they could have stopped that moment, they wouldn't have ended up in this power move that actually is going to probably hurt everybody. So whenever you're stuck, polarization is a kind of imaginative gridlock. That's just the way I look at it today. I look at my Facebook feed and I got friends that I look at them and think, I can't believe you are a Christian like, because of what you just posted. And I'm sure they think the same of me. That is imaginative gridlock.
Yeah. I'll build on that with just the thing when you asked us an exclamation question mark irk. My question mark to myself was, am I the roadblock? Am I imaginatively blocked, to use your language? And then just thinking, am I just churching harder? Am I just myself?
Yeah. So Dave, so let me just tell you that you just gave all of us a big gift. You're asking of that question, and you're asking of that question even out loud. Mm-hmm. Immediately opens it up, doesn't it? Like this is when you go look at because what a leader can always do in a moment like that is pause and take responsibility for their own growth. Mm-hmm. So when I ask, okay, how am I contributing to this thing? Mm-hmm. Everybody else can just take a deep breath and some will jump in and want to tell you, like, here's what you're doing, Dave. But what you really want is to inspire everybody to do the same thing. Let's all take a deep breath and ask, what am I doing or not doing mm-hmm. that is keeping us from moving forward? Mm-hmm. And when a community of people does that and grows that kind of trust to be able to do that, that's what in the leadership language, it's called a holding environment. It creates the safety to be able to keep raising the heat so that we can go through transformation. It's like I said, it's like a crock pot. Like mm-hmm. the crock pot is so safe, you can leave it on the counter, put in all the meat, and the heat itself is the right amount of heat that over the right amount of time will transform that raw food into a meal. Mm. And what you're doing with kind of vulnerably leading that process, when the whole group of people can do that, mm-hmm. you can actually begin to ask deeper questions and go further and begin to try experiments that are helpful.
One more that came in here. Somebody's over here like this. They said, COVID has forced us to drop many of our canoes. Which ones should we break up first to use for firewood?
Yeah. So think about this. Okay, here's one of the ways I have you think about this. This is the answer isn't which one do you break up first. This is okay. So disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. You guys are all going to be mad at me for this one. It's not about what you break out. It's ask this question: what's the journey and what do you keep? If the answer is we are committed to a water route, then you better keep a canoe. But if the answer is we are committed to discovering what God has for us in the future, then get ready to drop a lot of stuff. I mean, so here's where this is where I just like to shake stuff up. Yeah. Everybody I know is struggling with, when can we come back to our campus? Mm-hmm. And I think part of that is because for the last 30, 40 years, what we mostly did if we were vibrant churches is we built stuff. I did a 9-year building campaign at our church. We built our buildings. Our buildings today remind me of like the old church buses, right? You went to camp and you got a bus because it was easier to take the kids on a bus. Almost every church I know now says, we're going to sell that bus. That's kind of silly. Insurance is terrible. We don't always fill the bus. Maybe we'll get a couple of vans. Why don't we just carpool, right? Because the goal wasn't get everybody on a bus. The goal was get everybody to camp. And I think today we've got to grapple with which of the things that we have spent so much time investing in have become so important to us because we invested in them so much. But now we just got to ask ourselves what really matters.
Wow. That's a good one. Yeah.
Okay, good for now. You want to just take like a 2-minute bio break? We'll come back in maybe 5 minutes. I got to let